You see, an unthankful heart is a dangerous heart. Complaining heart is really the devil's playground. Devil's playground. He can get up to all manner of mischief when people are unhappy with their lot in life. Well, we are in Numbers chapter 11 this morning, and we are moving into some fairly dark chapters. Dark chapters. Numbers 1 to 10 has been by and large very positive. Very, very positive. We saw last week that everything God asked of his people, they did. They did. Chapter after chapter after chapter. But from chapter 11 onwards to about chapter 22, we have a litany of complaints and disobedience. It's been said that these next 10 chapters are as negative as the first 10 were positive. In chapter 11 and 12, Israel begin their journey from Sinai to Canaan. Not a long time, not even 2 weeks. Sure, it's 2 weeks on foot, but we're not talking about months. We're talking about days. And what we find from Numbers 11 through to the early 20s is that there are a number of complaints that initially seem to come from nowhere because Numbers 1 to 10 has been so positive. And these complaints follow a cycle. We're going to see this again and again today. We're going to see there's going to be a complaint. God hears the complaint. God is angry. He's not some happy customer service officer that apologizes profusely for the terrible service. God punishes the people. The people cry out to Moses. Moses prays for them. God responds, and then the punishment comes to an end. We're going to see this again and again and again. And we're going to look at some of the similarities and the differences that occur in these chapters of complaint. As we read earlier in the service, Philippians 2:14, do all things without complaining and disputing. Do all things. When we get up in the morning, when we get up tomorrow morning, do so without complaining and disputing. When you drive to work tomorrow, when you're in the traffic, drive without complaining and disputing. Now, I know this is very hard. When you get to school, kids, when you get to school and you've got to do maths, you've got to do something you don't like to do it without complaining and disputing. When you get home, you've got to get dinner ready. You've got to do the homework. Do those things without complaining or disputing. Deacons, when you have a meeting with me,
I'm going to tell you to stop complaining.
well, that wasn't in my notes. So you get the point, right? Do all things without complaining and disputing. Now, this is what the Bible tells us to do, but it's a command that we ignore, or we forget about, or we think that is actually not there. Do all things without complaining and disputing. Now, you look at verse 1. It says, "Now when the people complained, it displeased the Lord." They had an audience that they weren't counting on. They thought they were just complaining amongst themselves. They thought they could complain privately. But God heard them. It displeased him. for he heard it, and it says his anger was aroused. How angry did God get? Well, we got the answer. It says that the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some in the outskirts of the camp. It's not so much that they saw this big bonfire. Some of those complainers were in the bonfire. They're getting burned. Some people got burned alive, not for adultery or murder, but for complaining. Now think about that next time we are tempted to complain. Now, we're not given any specific reason for this complaint. Look, later we're told about some specifics. We'll see that today, but there's just this spirit of unhappiness. Those months, those 11 months in the same place, maybe brought some boredom. It obviously brought back memories of the country they had left. And the complaints started. It often just starts with one person with a big mouth that influences others. And it becomes like a wildfire. But this is what life was like in the camp. In fact, it says that it consumed some in the outskirts of the camp. Now, history does repeat itself. A few days after the deliverance out of the Red Sea in Exodus 15, the people complained against Moses and God. There was no water to drink. Here we have a few days after leaving Sinai, and people are complaining. But notice this in verse number 2. Then the people cried out to Moses, and when Moses prayed to the Lord, the fire was quenched. What stopped the consuming fire of God was Moses' prayer. That's what stopped it. But for Moses' intercession, that fire keeps burning. But for our intercessor, Jesus Christ, we'd be in great danger. Scripture says he ever lives to make intercession for us. And it is interesting that God's people would go back to Moses. Now later they would be complaining about him. And they'd have to go back to the person they complained against to ask him to pray to God to end the judgment. That's interesting. And they call the name of the place Taberah, or burning, because the fire of the Lord had burned among them. So who were causing the problems with this episode? Look at verse 4 of Numbers 11. Now the mixed multitude. I remember growing up in Sydney, and they had a thing called a mixed business, a mixed business. And you could buy about anything inside those mixed businesses, right? Here we have a mixed multitude. The word here is just used once in all of the Old Testament, and it's also translated and the rabble and the riffraff, right? The troublemakers, the discontent, the whingers, the mixed multitude who were among them yielded to intense craving. You see, it wasn't just the children of Israel that left Egypt. There were others who came with them. Maybe some Egyptians, perhaps slaves from other nations. And they hitched their wagon with the people of Israel. They would have been oppressed as well. They would have felt the sting of living under Pharaoh. And we're not exactly sure why they came. It doesn't seem like they joined with the children of Israel because they really wanted the one true and living God. They left because they wanted to worship the one true living God. Maybe they just wanted to leave Egypt because they hated Pharaoh They hated Pharaoh. They just wanted peace and quiet. They wanted a better life. And so they left with the children of Israel. Others had good intentions, but their hearts never really changed. And so you have these mixed multitude in verse 4 who had succumbed to some intense craving. They were missing what they had in Egypt. And then it says in verse 4, so the children of Israel also wept again and said, who will give us meat to eat? It was that bad egg, that rotten apple that spoiled the barrel. Now that happens. You know even in the workplace that you can be around some people that chronically complain, and that will get to you. 5 o'clock can't come faster when you're working with someone that just is constantly negative. And the mixed multitude rubbed off on God's people. In fact, they say in verse 5, we remember the fish which we ate freely. We had as much fish as we wanted, apparently. The cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, the garlic. I mean, we cook with all these things today. All these things we cook with. They missed. Now in verse 6, but now our whole being is dried up. There is nothing at all except this manna before our eyes. Do you know, back in Exodus 16, they complained that they had no food. Now they're complaining about the food. You ever had your kids say during holidays, we have nothing to do? And then you give them something to do. What's the complaint then? It's boring. It's boring. You can't win. You can't win. You see, we get bored because we're boring. We're boring. That's the problem. We're just boring people. We've got to be more imaginative with our time. So this mixed multitude had influenced God's people. So in verse 5, they remember the fish they ate freely, the cucumbers, the melons, leeks, onions, garlic. There's nothing here about we remember the slavery. We remember the abuse, the beatings we had. We remember this wonderful food that we had all the time. I mean, you think God had ripped them away from the best holiday they'd ever had. God just took them away from this paradise. No. God was delivering them to a paradise of sorts, a land flowing with milk and with honey. Instead of saying how good God has been to us, they say, how good was Egypt? That's what they said. God's people influenced by the mixed multitude who really did love the world. They loved it. They loved Egypt. Satan is an imitator. He is an infiltrator. It's not often the enemies outside the church who do the damage. It's often the counterfeiters that are inside. It's often an inside job of disgruntled, unhappy people that have to project their unhappiness on everyone else. You see, an unthankful heart is a dangerous heart. An unthankful, ungrateful heart is a dangerous heart. A complaining heart is really the devil's playground. Devil's playground. He can get up to all manner of mischief when people are unhappy with their lot in life. It gives way to an insatiable sense of envy and jealousy. It poisons our appreciation for what God has given to us. It's really It's really a violation of the last command, do not covet. It's a form of covetousness, to long for something that God has chosen not to give to us. Thomas Watson said, murmuring often ends in cursing, and our murmuring is the devil's music. But we get a sense of them missing some favourite food. Well, what had God given them? What had God given them? Look at verse 7 to verse 9. Now the manna, we learn of that first of all in Exodus, was like coriander seed, so it was flavoursome, and its colour, like the colour of bdellium or resin, it was a pale or white colour. So this would drop from the sky. If you could sort of imagine sort of dropping a bowl of porridge on the ground that just sort of all spreads out. Yeah? And it says, the people went about and gathered it, ground it on millstones, or beat it in the mortar, cooked it in pans and made cakes of it, and its taste was like the taste of pastry prepared with oil. This is appetizing. This is not unpleasant. It's not unpleasant. It's very pleasant food. It wasn't boring. It could be prepared in a number of ways: ground, boiled, baked. One translation has it this way: it was like something made with olive oil. Or it tasted like a pastry cooked with the finest oil. This was God's provision. Now, I read this for the first time this week, and it took me by surprise. But this was from a man who has written and studied the Old Testament in some detail, and he said this. He said, it may have looked somewhat like porridge, but it actually tasted more like the most delicious donuts. Now, I hadn't heard that one before. It was delicious. It was delicious. Well, if you and I had a delicious donut for breakfast and then had the same delicious donut for lunch and dinner, well, we could live with that. But whatever God sent down, whatever it was, you can only cook it so many ways. You can only do so much with it. And even if it was your favourite meal, even if it was your favourite meal, 11 months of that, you're going to get sick of it. Now listen, no one's going to die. No one's going to be malnourished. No one's going to miss out on what they need to live and to serve God, but it's going to be, by and large, fairly boring after a while. But this was God's provision. Psalm 78 says that God rained down manna on them to eat and given them of the bread of heaven. Men ate angels' food, whatever that means. Mate, angels' food. This was a special meal. This came from the Lord. This was his provision. Well, Moses hears the people weeping through their families in verse 10. I mean, they're weeping, they're crying over food. It's not that they're not safe. It's not that they haven't got other nations coming killing them. They're just upset because they haven't got the food that they used to have in Egypt. But they're free, they're not oppressed, they're safe, God's leading them. What God gave them was not enough for them. And here you have the anger of the Lord was greatly aroused, and this is warning time, because last time God was angry, he sent fire. You don't want God angry this way. Moses also was displeased. He's unhappy. God's angry. The people are complaining. There's no cheerful people here. So Moses said to the Lord, doesn't get much more intimate than this, why have you afflicted your servant? Lord, why am I going through such an awful time? And why have I not found favor in your sight, and that you have laid the burden of all these people on me? Moses says, if you had really blessed me, I wouldn't be leading these people. I'd have a good job. I'd have a good life. If you bless me, I wouldn't be here. I could lead some grateful people, just 10 of them, just a handful. But you haven't blessed me. It doesn't get much more direct than that. Their complaints hit Moses very hard. It's like a stomach punch. Moses had been singing triumphantly in chapter 10. Lord, rise up. Lord, return. Now he is lamenting bitterly the work God called him to do. You know, in Exodus 33, it says that God spoke to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend. So the Lord and Moses can speak to each other like face to face, and they can just share all that's in their heart. And Moses, very honest, says, Lord, if you had blessed me, why am I here with these people? This doesn't look like your blessing. It looks like something else. It looks like I'm wearing a curse for these people. Christ became a curse for us, friends. He became a curse for us. He identified with us in our sin. And it gets even more intimate in verse 12. He says, did I conceive all these people? It's like he's talking like a mother. Did I conceive them? I didn't give birth to these people. I didn't bring them into the world. Did I beget them that you should say to me, carry them in your bosom as a guardian carries a nursing child to the land which you swore to their fathers? Where am I to get meat to give to all these people? Can I provide meat for all these people? Can't do that either. For they weep all over me, saying, give us meat that we may eat, like little children, demanding food from Moses. And what Moses says in verse 14 is right. He says, I'm not able to bear all these people alone because the burden is too heavy for me. Of that, Moses is correct. He's right. Can't bear it alone. Can't bear it alone. You're going to have a nervous breakdown. You're going to quit. Right? You're going to go off the job. He can't do this alone. He says in verse 15, if you treat me like this, please kill me here and now. God had already done that. He'd done that with fire. So God can do that. If you treat me like this, please kill me here and now if I have found favor in your sight, and do not let me see my wretchedness. I mean, he's pouring his heart out. This is killing Moses. It's killing him. It's killing him. He said, did I conceive all these people? Remember back in Exodus when after the golden calf incident, and God's so angry with the people. And God says to Moses in Exodus 32, look what your people did. So God says to Moses. And Moses says, Lord, remember what you promised to your people. So God says to Moses, they're yours. Moses says, God, they're yours. You made the promise to Abraham. I wasn't there with Abraham. I wasn't there. Such is the burden of Moses, this mother imagery of, I didn't bring them into this world. Lord, you did. You promised them. They're your people. Friends, this is a burden for those in charge of others. This is a burden for those who lead others, because we know that they're the Lord's sheep. We know that they belong to the shepherd and that Jesus died on the cross for them. They belong to the shepherd, but you've got these under shepherds and they're carrying stuff as well. It's just, you can't avoid it. Yeah, they belong to the Lord, but I'm somehow responsible for what goes on. I remember talking to one pastor many years ago. He had some unsavory things go on in his church, and he said to me one day, he said, listen, I am pastoring the Corinthians, not the Ephesians, not the Bereans that sought the scriptures daily, but the Corinthians. Not a positive thought. But at least Moses prays. So what does God do? He gives some solutions. And the Lord never rebukes Moses in this chapter. Never does it. Never rebukes him. Because Moses brought those complaints to God. He brought them to him. I believe he had an honest heart. I believe he was pouring out his heart to God. And so God gives solutions. In verse 16, he says, "Gather to me 70 men of the elders of Israel, whom you know to be the elders of the people and officers over them. Bring them to the tabernacle of meeting, that they may stand there with you. I'll come down and talk with you there. I'll take of the spirit that is upon you, and I'll put the same upon them, and they shall bear the burden of the people with you, that you may not bear it yourself alone." God knew that Moses needed some extra help. That had to change. There were some things that were deficient in Moses' leadership. He needed extra help to come along. Valid. God sees it. He acts. But God hasn't forgotten about those complainers. He hasn't forgotten about that second round of complaint. Look at what God says in verse 18. "Then you shall say to the people, consecrate yourselves for tomorrow, and you shall eat meat." Oh, God's going to give them what they want. Yeah, he is. They complained, and God heard. They wanted, God's going to come through for them. "For you have wept in the hearing of the Lord, saying, who will give us meat to eat? For it was well with us in Egypt. Therefore the Lord will give you meat, and you shall eat." Look at verse 19. "You shall eat." And this is God speaking. This is the mouth of God. Not one day, nor 2, nor 5, nor 10, nor 20, but for a whole month, until it comes out of your nostrils. God says, I'm going to feed you. I'm going to look after you. I'm going to feed you. I'm just going to stand there feeding and feeding and feeding. You're going to have more and more and more, and just you hardly got any room, and you're going to get another mouthful. And it becomes loathsome to you, verse 20. You're going to start to hate this. You're going to hate it. Why? Because you have despised the Lord who's among you, and have wept before him, saying, why do we ever come out of Egypt? That's what made God angry, was they despised God's deliverance. They despised him. Now, what's Moses say? He says, the people whom I'm among are 600,000 men on foot, plus the wives and the children, lots of people. Yet you've said, I'll give them meat that they may eat for a whole month. God, how are you going to do that? I mean, it's one thing getting some bread from heaven. Meat, animals, it's another matter. He says, shall flocks and herds be slaughtered for them to provide enough for them, or shall all the fish of the sea be gathered together for them to provide enough for them? Moses isn't believing. How's this going to happen? Now, we're not going to get to all of this. We're going to have to save this rest of the chapter till next week. But God does exactly what he says. We'll see this next week. Erwin Lutzer said, complaining about our lot in life might seem quite innocent in itself, but God takes it personally. God takes it personally. You want to irritate the Lord? Be a complainer. It doesn't take some scandalous sin to raise and arouse the anger of God. Just be an unthankful, ungrateful person. That'll do it. They're going to become so well fed, they're going to regret ever complaining. They're going to wish they never began this cycle. This provision will be a double-edged sword. They'd be satisfied, but they'd be punished, and then they'd suffer. They get what they want, but they could never really enjoy it. That's what happens when people backslide into sin. They enjoy it for a little bit, and then they hate it. They hate it. Think about Ammon, who loved his half-sister, Tamar. He forced himself upon her in 2 Samuel 13, and after he had his way, it says the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he'd loved her. Hated her. A woman that he apparently loved so much. It was just lust. It was selfishness. To complain is natural. To give thanks is supernatural. It's supernatural. God gives a gracious heart, a thankful life. As we said last week, the destination is worth the journey. It's worth the journey. It's been said that 1 hour in heaven we shall be ashamed that we ever grumbled.